village called Dorfli. It perched halfway up the mighty Alm Mountain. One sunny June day, Heidi and her Aunt Deet were climbing the steep, rocky path that led from Dorfli up the mountain to where Heidi's grandfather, the Alm Uncle, lived. "You aren't taking the child to stay with the Alm Uncle?" the villagers exclaimed to Deet.
"I must."
Deet answered.
"Heidi has no parents, and I can't take care of her any longer. Let her grandfather manage for a while."
The villagers looked with pity at little Heidi. They knew her grandfather lived alone high on the Alm Mountain, and they were afraid of him. He had heavy gray eyebrows and a bushy beard. If he spoke at all, his voice was gruff. Poor little Heidi. Heidi stumbled along clumsily behind Aunt Deet. Her face was hot and red, and no wonder. In spite of the warm June sun, she was wearing 3 dresses, one over the other, a big red shawl, and heavy shoes and socks. She carried her straw hat. All the clothes that Heidi owned were on her back. As Heidi and her aunt climbed up the steep path, they were joined at a rickety little hut by Peter, the goat herd, and his flock of goats. Heidi noticed how easily the barefoot boy scrambled uphill. Without a word, she took off her shoes and socks and dresses and shawl. Then, in her bare feet and underclothes, she jumped and climbed after the goats as nimbly as any of them. When they finally reached the Alm Uncle's hut, he was sitting outside, looking down over the valley. "Well," he asked gruffly, "what does this mean?" Aunt Deet explained how he would have to keep Heidi now while she took a job in the city of Frankfurt. Then, fearing the angry look in the old man's eye, she said a quick goodbye and went back down the mountain. Heidi darted around, admiring the wide view of the valley and listening to the wind in the 3 tall fir trees behind the house.
"Where shall I sleep, grandfather?"
Heidi asked at last. The grandfather took her into the hut. "Sleep wherever you like," he said. Heidi saw a little ladder going up to the hayloft. Up there, in the sweet-smelling hay, she made her bed. Through a round window, she could look far down into the valley below.
"This is a lovely place to sleep,"
she called down. "I know all about it," the grandfather called back in a gruff voice. But underneath his bushy gray brows, his eyes twinkled. "This child is not lacking in brains," he said to himself. That evening for supper, Heidi had 2 bowls of delicious goat's milk and some cheese toasted in the open fireplace. Then she went up to her hayloft and slept as soundly as if she had been in the loveliest bed of some royal princess. Every morning, Peter brought the goats up the mountain. He would call for the grandfather's 2 goats, and Heidi often went up to the pasture with them. She and Peter would take a picnic lunch. The day passed pleasantly as they played with the lively animals and picked armfuls of wild flowers. Heidi grew very brown and strong and healthy, thanks to this outdoor life. She was as happy as the merry little birds in the trees of the green woods. When winter snows came, Peter no longer brought his flock up the mountain.
"Grandfather, will you take me down to visit Peter?"
Heidi asked one day. The grandfather bundled her up in a blanket and sat her on the sled in front of him. Then down the snowy mountain they coasted, the grandfather's gray beard flying out behind him. Heidi shrieked with delight. Peter had an old blind grandmother who lived in the rickety hut with him. She was happiest when Heidi could come to visit her. The grandfather would never go inside with Heidi on these visits, but he brought along his hammer and nails. Each time he would mend a shutter or a door, and soon the rickety little hut was made sound and strong. And then one day, Aunt Deet came back. She came to take Heidi to Frankfurt with her.
"There is a wealthy family with a sickly daughter there, and they want Heidi to be her playmate,"
she explained. The grandfather was angry at this. Heidi didn't want to go either, but Aunt Deet said,
"You can return soon with some soft white rolls for Peter's grandmother. That will make her very happy."
But when Heidi got to Frankfurt, she didn't like it at all. There was no grass, no mountains, no trees, only houses and streets. Clara, the little girl, had to lie on a couch or sit in a wheelchair all day. For her, the days were long and dreary until Heidi came. Heidi was fond of Clara and tried to amuse her. She once brought Clara a basket of kittens. They turned the whole household topsy-turvy, but they made Clara laugh. The girls had their lessons together, and Heidi learned to read at last. She saved all the soft white rolls from her meals, though they grew hard and stale in her closet. Meanwhile, the weeks dragged on in Frankfurt. Heidi grew pale, and her eyes lost their sparkle. She missed her grandfather. She missed All Mountain. She missed Peter and the old grandmother and the frisky goats in the high pasture. Finally, Clara's father saw how homesick the child was. "Heidi, do you want to go home to your mountain?" he asked.
Yes, oh yes.
The little girl cried. So she returned to the grandfather on the Alm Mountain. But she came back with presents for everybody, and later Clara was brought in her wheelchair to visit Heidi and the grandfather. The meals of goat's milk and cheese were the most delicious Clara had ever tasted, and never had she slept so well. The grandfather made a second bed of hay in the loft next to Heidi's. At night, both of the girls would look at the starry sky through the little round window, and they would fall asleep to the sound of the wind roaring through the 3 fir trees. The grandfather took good care of Clara, and she grew strong and rosy too. Only Peter was unhappy, for Heidi had no time to play with him anymore. One morning, Peter did something dreadful. He took the empty wheelchair and pushed it down the mountain, so that it broke into hundreds of pieces. "Now," he thought, "Clara will have to go back to Frankfurt, and I will have Heidi for my playmate again." But when the grandfather carried Clara outside, he thought the wind had blown the chair down the mountain.
Oh,
Wailed Clara.
now I will have to go home, for I have no chair.
Heidi tried to think of some new plan.
If only you could walk.
She coaxed, and she made Clara stand up while she held Clara's arm.
Now just stamp your feet down and try.
She pleaded. Peter, who was feeling sorry about the wheelchair, came and helped too. And Clara dared to take one firm step upon the ground, and then another, and another.
I can, Heidi. Oh, I can. See? See, I can take steps one after another. I can walk.
And even the grandfather came running to see the wonderful sight that had made them all so happy. When Clara's father arrived to take her home to Frankfurt, there was a marvelous surprise in store for him. Coming toward him from the hut was a tall girl leaning on little Heidi. His Clara was walking. "This is a joy to me, child. This is a great joy to me," the father cried. "Heidi, you have been such a help. Will you come back to Frankfurt to live with us?" But Heidi clung to the grandfather.
I don't ever want to leave my mountain again.
She said. So Clara's father promised that instead, Clara should come back every summer and visit on the Alm. "And now," he said, "it is time for us to go." Heidi and the grandfather waved goodbye. Then, hand in hand, they turned happily toward their hut, which was all golden in the setting sun. That night, Heidi was very joyful as she climbed up to her bed. She had seen all the mountains and cliffs glowing in the sunset. She had heard the fir trees roaring in the wind. She was at home forever, high on her beloved mountain.
Once there was a little black colt. He lived in a green and pleasant meadow with his mother. There were other colts there, too, and he had great fun galloping and romping around the field with them. One day, when the playing became rather rough, with much biting and kicking, his mother whinnied to him and said,
These are very good colts, but they have not learned manners. I hope you will grow up to be gentle and good. Always do your work with a will. Lift your feet up well, and never bite or kick, not even in play.
The little colt never forgot her advice. The colt played in the fields until he was full grown. He grew big and strong, with a pretty white star on his forehead, one white foot, and a soft, shiny black coat. One day, Squire Gordon saw how handsome he was and decided to buy him. I will wait until he's well broken in, he said. The horse's master replied, I'll break him in myself, so he won't be frightened or hurt. Patiently, he taught the young horse how to hold a bit and wear a bridle. He fed him oats and talked softly to him as he put on the saddle. Then he taught him to carry his master, to wear a harness, and to pull a little cart. When the man from Squire Gordon's came for him, the master said, "Goodbye. Be a good horse and always do your best." Thus, the young horse left his first home. The new home was pleasant. There were 2 other horses, Merrylegs, a fat, jolly, dappled gray pony, and Ginger, a tall chestnut. They all became great friends. The first time the new horse carried his master, he remembered his mother's advice and did exactly what Squire Gordon wanted. Mrs. Gordon and their 2 little girls were at the door when they came back from the ride. "We couldn't want a better horse," Squire Gordon told them. "What shall we name him?"
He's really quite a beauty.
Said Mrs. Gordon.
What do you say to calling him Black Beauty?
"Very good," said the squire. "Black Beauty shall be his name." And so it was. Black Beauty enjoyed many happy years at Squire Gordon's. He loved his master and his mistress and their children, and he enjoyed carrying them on his back or drawing them in the cart. He also loved John Manley, the coachman who drove them when he and Ginger were put in double harness in the big carriage. One day, a new stable boy named Joe Green came to help John. He was young, but he was willing and wanted to learn. Soon after Joe came, Mrs. Gordon became suddenly ill in the night. John saddled Black Beauty quickly, and off they went for Dr. White. It was a long, hard run through the village, over the hill, on past woods and fields, 8 long miles at a full gallop. Dr. White was in bed, but he dressed quickly, mounted Black Beauty, and dashed back as fast as the tired horse could go. John, the groom, walked all the way back. When the doctor and Beauty returned, little Joe Green took care of the weary animal. But he didn't know that Black Beauty should have had a blanket. And he let him drink much too much cold water. By morning, the poor horse was terribly sick. With the aid of the horse doctor, and thanks to weeks of loving care, Beauty was nursed back to health. But it was a long time before he was quite well again. Black Beauty's speed and strength had saved Mrs. Gordon's life, but her doctor said she would have to move away to a warmer country. Everyone was very sad when the house was closed, and Black Beauty and Ginger were sent to an estate called Earlshall Park, where they drew the carriage for their new mistress. They were treated well enough, but there was one careless groom. Late one night, this groom was galloping Black Beauty home from the village over a stony road when one of the horse's shoes came off. The stones hurt the bare hoof dreadfully, but the groom whipped Black Beauty on at such speed that the horse stumbled and fell violently on both knees, sending his rider sprawling. Beauty's knees were badly bruised. Even after he had been put out to pasture for several months, his knees were still so swollen that his master couldn't use him. So, Black Beauty was sold to a livery stable. Now Black Beauty discovered how many different kinds of people there are in the world. He was rented to anyone who had the price of a few hours' drive. Some drove him well, but others drove him badly, whipping him up steep hills and never allowing him to rest. Poor Black Beauty. He was becoming so worn out that he could scarcely do his work. So the owner of the livery stable had to put him up for sale at the horse fair. There, Black Beauty met all sorts of horses, young and old, sleek and shabby. There were many kinds of men bargaining for them, too. One quiet, cheerful little man, after looking at the other horses, came back and bought Black Beauty. His name was Jerry Barker, and he was a London cab driver. When they came to Jerry's home in a little side street, his wife Polly and their children all ran out to see the new horse. It was a lively greeting. The children petted him. Polly brought him some bran mash, and Jerry rubbed him down. Then Beauty was put into a comfortable, clean-smelling stall. Life was not so bad after all. For several years he worked as a cab horse. It was hard work, but Jerry was such a thoughtful driver that Black Beauty was quite happy. Jerry used to say to him, "Do your best and leave the rest. 'Twill all come right some day or night." One New Year's Eve, it was bitter cold, with a sharp, driving sleet. Jerry and Beauty had taken two young men to a party. The men made them wait for 2 hours in the icy wind and sleet, and Jerry caught a bad cold. He gave his horse extra care when they got home, but the next day he was very sick himself. Black Beauty never saw him again. Jerry recovered, but he had to give up his cab and take easier work, so Black Beauty was sold to a baker. The baker overloaded his cart so much that the poor horse could scarcely pull it, and so he was sold again, this time to a cruel wagon owner who used Beauty even worse than the baker had. One day, while trying to pull an overloaded wagon up Ludgate Hill, Beauty fell down and couldn't get up by himself. He was helped up and led home. It was plain to see that Black Beauty's working days were over, so he was sent off to the horse fair once more. This time, he was bought by a gentleman farmer named Mr. Thoroughgood, who could tell that Beauty was a good horse who had seen better days. With gentle care, Mr. Thoroughgood helped him back to health and strength, so that by spring, he was almost as handsome as ever. Then Mr. Thoroughgood sold Beauty to 3 very nice ladies. When their groom saw him, he said, "That is just like the star Black Beauty had." When he examined him more closely and saw that it really was Black Beauty, he was overjoyed. "Beauty, do you know me?" he cried. "I'm Joe Green, who used to be Squire Gordon's groom." And indeed it was the same Joe Green, grown to be a man. "It won't be my fault if you don't have good times from now on," he said, as he patted the horse happily. And so, Black Beauty's troubles were over at last. The ladies promised never to sell him again, and with Joe Green to care for him, and with pleasant green fields to run in, Black Beauty had nothing to fear. He had a happy home for the rest of his life.
This concludes my video. Thanks for watching.